My name is Evelyn, and I am 36 years old. On the cold evening of Christmas Eve, my wealthy parents handed out expensive gifts to every single grandchild at the dinner table except mine. The children of my older brother each received a heavy wrapped box with a card that read, "To the grandchildren who protect our pristine family image." My 8-year-old daughter Maya stared completely silently at the empty wooden table in front of her. My 5-year-old son Leo looked up with tear-filled eyes and softly asked if Santa had completely forgotten about him. The teenage son of my brother looked across the massive dining table at my children and laughed a cruel laugh. The boy smirked and whispered that they simply did not earn a gift. I did not yell at them. I did not shed a single tear. Standing up slowly, I picked up my crying children, grabbed our heavy winter coats, and walked straight out the front door of the massive rural farmhouse. Driving down the dark dirt roads of our small town, I pulled my car over onto the quiet street. Sitting in the dark, I sent one single text message to the main family group chat. Within a matter of seconds, my cell phone completely exploded with notifications. My father, my mother, and my older brother were calling me nonstop. But here is what none of those arrogant people knew. The exact thing I did next would cost them their entire small-town empire. Welcome back to Drama Storytime, where we uncover the darkest family secrets and the incredible power of walking away. If you are new here, this channel brings you intense, real-life stories of betrayal, survival, and ultimate revenge. Drop a comment with your thoughts as you listen and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single update. Now let me take you back to the beginning to explain exactly how a single holiday dinner destroyed an entire family legacy. Growing up in the quiet rural town of Riverbend was supposed to be peaceful, but my parents controlled the entire main street. They owned the massive hardware store, the local diner, and most of the commercial buildings in the town center. They treated the local working-class people with absolute disgust. They always expected me to marry a wealthy politician to expand their local power. Instead, I fell deeply in love with a kind, hard-working farmer named Thomas. When Thomas passed away from a sudden illness 3 years ago, my parents did not offer me any comfort. They simply mocked me for choosing a poor man and forced me to live in a tiny, worn-out cottage on the edge of town. They punished my innocent children simply because they hated the man I chose to love. They had absolutely no idea that the poor farmer they constantly insulted was secretly holding the master key to their entire fake kingdom. Part 2: The Snowstorm and the Iron Lockbox. The drive back to our small wooden cottage felt incredibly long and incredibly cold. The heavy winter snow was falling rapidly, covering the dark dirt roads of the rural town in a thick blanket of freezing white. Inside the rusted car, the silence was absolutely heartbreaking. My son Leo was softly crying in the back seat, still asking why the wealthy family hated him so much. My daughter Maya was staring out the frosted window with a completely blank expression on her face. My heart shattered into a million tiny pieces, watching my innocent children suffer simply because of the disgusting arrogance of my own blood relatives. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The text message I had sent to the family group chat was very simple, but incredibly dangerous. I wrote that their fake plastic kingdom was built on stolen dirt, and the true owner was finally coming to collect the ultimate debt. Within 30 seconds, my cell phone began vibrating violently against the center console. My father, the cruel ruler of the local economy, called me 7 times in a row. My mother, who cared more about her expensive jewelry than her own grandchildren, sent multiple messages demanding an immediate apology. My older brother sent a harsh voicemail calling me an ungrateful failure and threatening to completely ruin my life if I ever embarrassed them again. I did not answer a single call. I simply turned the phone completely off and focused entirely on the snowy road ahead. When we finally arrived at the tiny dilapidated cottage on the extremely isolated edge of town, the temperature had dropped significantly. The old heating system barely worked, and the cold wind howled through the thin glass windows. I carried my sleeping son into his tiny dark bedroom and tucked him under 3 thick wool blankets to keep him warm. My daughter sat on the edge of her small bed holding a cheap handmade rag doll. She looked up at me and quietly stated that the wealthy family did not love them because they were poor. I sat next to her and gently brushed the hair out of her eyes. I told her that real wealth is measured by kindness, and that the cruel people in the massive mansion were actually the poorest people in the entire world. I kissed her cold forehead and waited in the quiet darkness until she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Once the tiny cottage was completely silent, I walked into the dark kitchen and poured a cup of hot black tea. I opened the bottom wooden cabinet and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron lockbox. This heavy box belonged to my late husband. My husband was a quiet, gentle, and incredibly humble man who spent his entire life working the rural dirt with his bare hands. My parents constantly mocked him during family dinners, calling him a worthless peasant who would never amount to anything. They assumed he had absolutely nothing to offer their elite high society circle. But my cruel parents were completely blinded by their own massive, towering egos. They never bothered to research the actual detailed history of the rural town they claimed to own and control. I unlocked the heavy iron box and carefully pulled out a stack of fragile yellow papers. It was the original legal land deed from over 100 years ago. When the rural town of Riverbend was first established, the great-grandfather of my husband owned the entire central commercial valley. Over the decades, the humble farming family sold off small pieces of the outer land just to survive the harsh winters. But they never sold the main commercial street right in the center of the town. They simply leased the dirt to the growing town on a standard 99-year commercial agreement. My arrogant parents had aggressively built their massive hardware store, their expensive luxury diner, and their towering corporate offices directly on top of dirt they did not actually legally own. The entire foundation of their massive family wealth was resting on a temporary piece of paper. And the absolute best part of the hidden secret was the specific expiration date. The 99-year lease was officially expiring on the very first day of January, which was exactly 1 single week away. I spent the next 3 hours sitting at the small kitchen table, carefully reading every single legal clause and historical addendum printed on the fragile paper. The terms of the ancient lease were incredibly strict and completely unforgiving. If the commercial lease was not formally renewed by the legal landowner before the stroke of midnight on the final day of the year, all physical structures built on the property would automatically default to the ownership of the landholder. My cruel family had spent millions of dollars building their shiny rural empire, but because they were too arrogant to check the historical archives, they were about to lose absolutely everything to the widow they despised. Suddenly, the loud, aggressive sound of heavy tires crunching on the snowy driveway broke the quiet silence of the small cottage. I looked out the frosted kitchen window and saw the expensive luxury truck of my brother parked directly on my front lawn. My brother and my angry father stepped out of the heavy vehicle into the freezing snow. They marched up to my wooden front porch and began pounding violently on the front door. They were absolutely furious about the vague text message I had sent and wanted to assert their absolute dominance. My father yelled loudly through the thin wooden door, demanding that I open it immediately and apologize on my knees for insulting the pristine family honor. I did not open the door. I stood completely still in the dark hallway, holding the original fragile land deed in my shaking hands. My brother yelled that if I did not open the door, they would immediately cut off the tiny monthly grocery allowance they used to financially control me. He arrogantly stated that without their generous money, my children would starve and freeze in the brutal winter. They genuinely believed I was a weak, helpless widow who would eventually crawl back and beg for their toxic approval. I remained completely silent. I let them stand in the freezing cold wind, shouting like absolute lunatics for 20 long minutes. My father eventually cursed, loudly kicked the wooden steps, and drove away into the dark, snowy night. They thought they had won another psychological battle and put me back in my place. They had absolutely no idea that while they were yelling at a closed wooden door, I was holding the exact legal document that would completely erase their entire existence from the town of Riverbend forever. Part 3. The Glass Boardroom and the Perfect Guillotine. The morning after the heavy snowstorm arrived with a brilliant and freezing sunlight, I woke up incredibly early and prepared a warm breakfast for my two children. They sat at the small wooden table, eating their warm oatmeal, completely unaware of the massive storm I was preparing to unleash. After ensuring they were safe and comfortable, I called a trusted neighbor to watch them for the entire day. I put on my heaviest winter coat, grabbed the rusted iron lockbox, and walked through the thick snow to the small rural train station. I knew that hiring a local attorney in the town of Riverbend would be an absolute disaster. My wealthy father played golf with the local judge and heavily bribed the only two law firms in the county. If I took the fragile land deed to them, they would simply destroy the evidence or warn my arrogant family immediately. So I bought a cheap ticket and rode the train for 3 long hours to a massive, towering city far away from their toxic influence. I walked into the grand lobby of the most ruthless and expensive commercial real estate law firm in the entire state. The young receptionist looked at my worn-out boots and my cheap winter coat with a slight hint of judgment. She softly asked if I had a formal appointment. I did not say a single word. I simply opened the heavy iron box and placed the ancient yellow land deed directly on her polished marble desk. I politely requested exactly 5 minutes with their senior managing partner. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in a massive glass boardroom high above the busy city streets. A tall, sharp man wearing a custom-tailored suit walked into the room. He introduced himself as the senior partner who specialized in historic land disputes and hostile corporate takeovers. He sat across from me and carefully examined the fragile document using a bright magnifying glass. The massive room was perfectly silent for 15 long minutes. I sat completely still listening to the slow ticking of the large wall clock. The sharp lawyer finally leaned back in his expensive leather chair and let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at me with a completely bewildered expression on his face. He softly stated that he had seen many aggressive business contracts in his 30-year career, but this specific document was a perfect legal guillotine. He confirmed that the 99-year commercial lease was completely valid and practically unbreakable. Because my arrogant parents had never formally requested a renewal extension, the trap was officially armed and ready to drop. He leaned forward and explained the precise legal strategy. We would remain completely silent for the next 6 days. We would let my cruel family celebrate their expensive New Year parties and drink their premium champagne. We would let them continue running their massive hardware store and their luxury diner, believing they owned the entire world. And then the absolute second the clock struck midnight on the first day of January, the land lease would officially expire. Every single brick, every single glass window, and every single piece of valuable inventory sitting on that specific dirt would legally transfer to my name. I looked at the senior lawyer and slowly nodded my head. I told him I did not want a single penny of financial settlement. I wanted total, absolute destruction of their fake rural empire. The sharp man smiled a very cold and calculated smile. He called his entire team of junior associates into the glass room, and they spent the next 8 hours drafting the most devastating legal eviction notices in the history of the county. While I was sitting in a warm boardroom planning a massive financial massacre, my cruel family was completely oblivious back in the small town. My wealthy mother spent her afternoon loudly complaining to her rich friends at the local country club about my terrible attitude. She falsely claimed I was mentally unstable and a terrible mother for leaving the holiday dinner early. My arrogant brother was busy ordering expensive new inventory for the massive hardware store, completely unaware that he was actually buying all of those expensive tools for me. They were dancing wildly on the deck of a massive sinking ship, and the dark, icy water was finally starting to rise. Part 4: The Midnight Countdown and the Silent Transfer. The next 6 days moved incredibly slowly. The snowy town of Riverbend was busy preparing for the massive New Year celebrations. The wealthy parents of mine were hosting the most expensive and exclusive party of the entire decade at the local country club. They spent over $50,000 on imported champagne and premium caviar just to impress the local politicians. My older brother was walking around the town square wearing an expensive tailored suit, bragging to everyone about his massive plans to expand the hardware store in the spring. They were entirely drunk on their own fake power and complete arrogance. Back at the tiny wooden cottage, I sat by the small, warm fire with my 2 children. We drank hot chocolate and played simple card games on the worn-out rug. I did not receive a single text message or a single phone call from my wealthy family during those 6 days. They had completely discarded us, just like they always did. They genuinely believed their harsh silence was punishing me. They had absolutely no idea their silence was actually giving me the perfect cover to finalize their total destruction. On the final night of the year, the heavy snow started falling again. The luxury country club was packed with 300 wealthy guests. A live jazz band was playing loud music while my mother danced in a custom silk dress. She raised her glass and made a grand speech about the enduring legacy and absolute power of our family name. She confidently stated that the upcoming year would be their most profitable and dominant year ever. The crowd cheered loudly and raised their expensive glasses to the ceiling. Miles away in the quiet darkness, I was sitting at my small kitchen table, staring at the glowing clock on the wall. The time was 11:55 in the evening. I held a warm cup of tea and watched the seconds slowly tick by. In the massive city far away, my brilliant legal team was standing by inside their glass boardroom. They had armed local process servers waiting inside dark vehicles parked directly outside the country club and the massive commercial properties in town. The final minute arrived. The wealthy crowd at the country club began loudly counting down from 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The massive room erupted in loud cheers and bright confetti rained down from the ceiling. They kissed their wealthy friends and drank their expensive wine. At that exact second, the ancient 99-year commercial lease officially expired. The massive hardware store, the luxury diner, and the towering corporate offices instantly became the absolute legal property of the poor widow they had completely thrown away. The silent transfer of ultimate power was incredibly beautiful. I took a slow sip of my warm tea and smiled into the dark room. The trap was permanently locked, and the morning sun was going to bring absolute hell to the town of Riverbend. Part 5. The Industrial Chains and the Morning Panic. The first morning of the new year brought a blinding bright sun to the snowy town of Riverbend. The wealthy family slept late into the afternoon, completely exhausted from their massive, expensive party. My older brother woke up with a terrible headache and decided to drive down to the massive hardware store to check the inventory logs. Driving his expensive luxury truck, he pulled into the main commercial lot and immediately noticed something incredibly wrong. The heavy steel gates of the massive store were securely locked with thick industrial chains. Standing in front of the glass doors were 4 large security guards wearing completely black uniforms. The arrogant brother jumped out of his truck and marched toward the guards, screaming furiously. He demanded that they open the doors immediately and threatened to fire every single one of them. The head security guard did not blink or say a single word. Stepping forward, a man in a sharp gray suit handed my brother a thick stack of legal documents. The man was an official process server hired by my ruthless legal team in the city. Tearing open the heavy envelope, my brother quickly scanned the first page of the legal notice. The color completely drained from his arrogant face as he read the terrible words. The document clearly stated that the historic land lease had expired at exactly midnight. It explicitly outlined that the entire building, along with all of the expensive inventory inside, was now the sole legal property of the permanent landowner. He dropped the papers onto the snowy ground and started to hyperventilate. Grabbing his cell phone, he desperately called the wealthy parents who were still sleeping in their massive rural mansion. The phone rang 10 times before my father finally answered with a groggy and angry voice. Before my brother could even explain the massive financial disaster, a loud, aggressive knock echoed through the heavy wooden doors of the mansion. Walking downstairs in his expensive silk robe, my father forcefully opened the front door. He found 2 more process servers standing on his snowy front porch, holding massive leather briefcases. They handed him exactly 3 thick envelopes containing immediate eviction notices for the commercial hardware store, the luxury town diner, and the corporate office building. The powerful man who controlled the entire local economy looked down at the official court stamps on the paper and felt his chest tighten with absolute panic. He slowly turned to the second page of the document to see who had orchestrated this massive corporate attack. He saw the name of the new absolute legal owner printed clearly at the very bottom of the page in bold black ink. Reading the full legal name of the poor widow he had cruelly thrown out of his holiday dinner, he finally realized his fatal mistake. He dropped his expensive coffee mug onto the hardwood floor and watched it shatter into a million tiny pieces. The fake kingdom was officially dead. Part 6. The Broken Phones and the Private Guards. The wealthy father rushed back into his massive mansion and immediately dialed the number of his personal local attorney. Screaming into the receiver, he demanded an emergency court order to break the heavy chains off the commercial buildings. The local lawyer listened to the frantic explanation and then went completely silent on the other end of the line. The nervous attorney softly explained that the historic land lease was absolutely ironclad and completely unbreakable. He informed the angry father that the law firm representing the poor widow was the most powerful and ruthless corporate legal team in the entire state. No local judge would ever dare to challenge them because the federal laws regarding historic land deeds were perfectly clear. The massive empire built on stolen dirt was legally gone forever. Hearing the terrible news, the wealthy mother walked down the grand staircase wearing a silk robe. She demanded to know why her husband was screaming in the early morning. Turning to face his wife, the defeated man explained that they had just lost the massive hardware store, the corporate offices, and her beloved luxury diner. The arrogant woman let out a loud, terrified scream and completely collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase. She used that expensive diner to host her high society luncheons and show off her fake wealth to the entire town. Losing that property meant losing her entire social status in the local community. Desperation finally replaced their massive, towering egos. My father picked up his cell phone and started calling my personal number. He called exactly 25 times in a row, leaving frantic voicemails begging for a simple family meeting. He actually tried to use the word family to manipulate the exact daughter he had cruelly abandoned in the freezing snow just 1 week prior. Sitting in my warm kitchen, I listened to the pathetic voicemails while drinking my morning tea. I did not answer a single call, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the greedy monsters. Realizing that phone calls were completely useless, the panicked parents and the furious brother jumped into their luxury vehicles. They drove recklessly through the snowy streets of the small town, heading straight toward the tiny wooden cottage on the edge of the county. They expected to bully a weak widow into signing the valuable properties back over to them. They genuinely thought they could just yell loud enough to reverse the massive legal transfer. They had absolutely no idea that a massive team of private security guards was already waiting for them in the freezing snow. Part 7. The Human Wall in the Freezing Reality. The 3 expensive luxury vehicles sped down the dark dirt road and aggressively parked on the snowy grass outside the tiny wooden cottage. The wealthy parents and the older brother jumped out of their warm cars, breathing heavy clouds of white air into the freezing winter morning. They marched toward the small wooden front porch, fully expecting to kick the thin door open and verbally destroy the poor widow inside. Before they could even take 10 steps toward the house, 4 massive black sport utility vehicles suddenly pulled out from behind the old wooden barn. 8 heavily armed private security guards wearing thick black winter coats stepped out into the deep snow and formed a solid human wall directly in front of the small cottage. The wealthy father completely froze in his tracks. He started shouting at the guards, demanding that they move aside so he could speak to his ungrateful daughter. The massive man in charge of the security team stepped forward and firmly told the arrogant man to remain exactly where he was. The guard calmly explained that any attempt to step onto the private property would result in an immediate federal arrest for severe criminal trespassing. The cruel mother tried to use her fake high society voice to manipulate the tall guards. She claimed it was just a simple family misunderstanding and that they desperately needed to go inside to see her lovely grandchildren. The security captain simply stared at her with completely cold eyes and told her that the legal owner of the property had strictly forbidden any physical contact. Standing inside the warm cottage, I watched the entire pathetic scene through the frosted glass window. I held a warm cup of coffee and smiled as the arrogant people who used to control my entire life were publicly humiliated in the freezing snow. My angry brother threw his hands in the air and screamed at the house, calling me a terrible monster for stealing their money. He had completely forgotten that he was the exact person who laughed at my crying children just a few days ago. The defeated family stood in the freezing cold for 30 long minutes, desperately trying to bribe the security team with promises of future wealth. The highly trained guards simply ignored them and kept their hands resting near their heavy utility belts. Realizing they were completely powerless against the massive wall of security, the wealthy family slowly retreated back to their luxury cars. They drove away in absolute silence, leaving the quiet rural property exactly the way they found it. The balance of power in the small town of Riverbend had officially shifted forever. The greedy monsters were completely locked out of their fake empire, and the poor widow was sitting warmly on her new massive throne. Part 8. The Empty Vaults in the Basement Exile. The next several weeks brought absolute financial ruin to the arrogant family. Without the massive hardware store and the luxury diner generating daily cash, they could not pay the massive monthly mortgages on their rural mansion. The wealthy father tried to secure emergency commercial loans from the local rural banks, but every single bank manager completely refused to help him because he no longer owned the valuable commercial dirt in the center of town. The cruel mother tried to sell her expensive custom jewelry to wealthy friends at the country club just to keep up her fake high society image. But the wealthy friends had already heard the terrible news about the historic land lease. High society is incredibly cruel to people who suddenly lose their massive fortunes. The people who used to drink her expensive champagne now completely ignored her phone calls and whispered about her epic downfall behind her back. My older brother faced the absolute worst punishment of all. He had secretly taken out massive personal loans using the future profits of the hardware store as collateral. Because the store now legally belonged to me, the angry debt collectors immediately seized his expensive luxury truck and drained his personal bank accounts. He was forced to move back into the dark basement of the massive rural mansion, completely broke and entirely humiliated. Meanwhile, I hired a wonderful team of honest local managers to run the commercial properties. I doubled the hourly wages of the hard-working employees and lowered the prices of the goods to actually help the struggling farming community. The town of Riverbend quickly realized that the new owner was far better than the cruel family that had exploited them for decades. The fake empire was systematically dismantled piece by piece. The arrogant family was forced to watch from a distance as I completely erased their toxic legacy and replaced it with genuine kindness and fairness. They were finally learning the brutal lesson that real power does not come from stolen dirt or expensive suits. Real power comes from patience and the absolute perfect timing of a silent revenge. Part 9. The foreclosed mansion and the tiny apartment. The financial bleeding eventually became completely impossible to stop. By the end of the third month, the massive city banks officially foreclosed on the grand rural mansion. The cruel parents and the arrogant brother were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the massive property. The local sheriff arrived on a cold Tuesday morning to enforce the strict legal eviction. The wealthy family was forced to pack their remaining clothes into cheap plastic garbage bags because they had already sold all of their expensive designer luggage just to buy basic groceries. The local townspeople stood on the quiet, snowy sidewalks and watched in absolute silence as the greedy family was permanently escorted off the massive estate. There was absolutely no sympathy from the local community. The people of Riverbend simply watched the ultimate karma completely destroy the towering egos of the people who had treated them like dirt for decades. Having absolutely zero money left in their frozen bank accounts, the ruined family was forced to leave the beautiful town center. They rented a tiny, rusted apartment in a highly dangerous and run-down neighborhood in the next county. The cruel mother who used to wear custom silk dresses and host massive charity galas was now forced to sleep on a cheap, thin mattress in a room that smelled like old chemical bleach. My older brother was forced to find a minimum wage job working the night shift at a greasy fast food restaurant just to pay their cheap monthly rent. While they lived in absolute miserable poverty, I was busy building a beautiful new life for my two innocent children. We moved out of the freezing wooden cottage and purchased a gorgeous warm farmhouse surrounded by tall green trees and a quiet rushing river. My young son completely stopped asking why the cruel family hated him. My sweet daughter finally smiled a genuine, beautiful smile every single day. The heavy, dark storm had officially passed, and the bright, warm sun was finally shining on the people who actually deserved peace. Part 10. The Ultimate Karma and the Final Lesson. It has been exactly 2 years since that terrible holiday dinner. I never spoke to my cruel parents or my older brother ever again. I completely blocked their phone numbers and erased their toxic existence from my mind. I heard quiet rumors from the local townspeople that the cruel mother completely refuses to leave her tiny, dirty apartment because she is far too deeply ashamed to show her face in public. The arrogant father sits in silence all day, completely broken by the massive loss of his fake rural empire. Karma is an incredibly patient and perfect judge. When you build your entire life on a foundation of pure greed and cruelty, the universe will eventually tear it all completely down. My toxic family thought they could easily break my innocent children by denying them simple wrapped gifts at a holiday table. They had absolutely no idea they were actually handing me the exact motivation to take their entire world away. Family is never just about blood. True family is about who stays by your side and protects you from the freezing cold. I chose to protect my children, and it was the absolute greatest decision I have ever made. Thank you so much for listening to Drama Storytime today. If you loved this story of ultimate karma and survival, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever watched karma completely destroy a toxic person? Share your amazing experiences in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another intense family drama. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next video. The next video.